Constructivism Theory as I Perceive It by Danielle Holliday. So let's evaluate why this theory came about. Those who developed the constructivist approach to human communication were interested in understanding people's interpretations of how the social world influenced their communicative behavior. The philosophies that have been credited as the cornerstone of the constructivist theory primarily rest on these three men pictured here. Wayne Brockreed argued that in communication studies, analysts have failed to distinguish between philosophical assumptions and a theoretical orientation. There was a need, he argued, to define these so that they are separate but do not have to be dependent on one another, as tradition would have it. Tradition dictated, by and large, that people communicated based on their interpretation reaction of their lives with the same reality perspective their entire life. Brockreed's conclusions were based on his interpretations of the social science theories and philosophies of academics such as Paget and Mead. Paget and Mead both believed that their effective communication depended on the ability to imaginatively construct or interpret the perspectives of others. Communication was viewed as a skill or an art for accomplishing social goals. This led the pioneers of this theory into evaluating how variation in individuals with respect to the perception of people and events were related to the use of communication and to what extent the respective individual was effective in their methods. It would take much longer than 15 minutes to evaluate all of the philosophies behind this theory, as it can be argued that every single claim made in social and philosophical sciences up until this point could be a part of the foundation, brought researchers to the definition of this theory. I have merely referenced the three main scientists who were referenced in the seminal work, more specifically in their introductions and foundations. One underlying notion of this theory, and arguably all of communication studies, is that people communicate based on their view of reality. How people do this and to what degree is another study in itself, but for this theory, we focus on the forefront of communication and how individuals perceive prior to responding both verbally and non-verbally as a cause of the conclusion from that initial perception. Interpretive orientation is the idea that people's view of reality is an ongoing lifelong process. Up until this point, as was suggested by the conclusions of scholars like Brockreed, communication theories and studies assume the opposite, to some degree, that one's view of reality is established once and maintains the same view throughout their entire life. Delia and Grossberg, in 1977, further defines interpretive orientation with respect to communication as an emergent creative activity through which human social reality is constantly being recreated, affirmed, repaired, and changed. Within interpretive social theories, persons are agents of actions, not mere responders to events. Actors are capable of creative originative action, and consequently, communication is not completely bound by its past, but involves an emergent process in which social, that is to say intersubjective, reality is constituted. Interpretive views of communication recognize this creative emergent process of the social reconstruction of reality as involving an interplay of the individual interpretive process and socially and historically constituted processes and contexts. The notion of how reality is developed in a person's mind is what led to the constructivist theory. I have used this comic as a simple way to explain how perspectives can be different based on each individual's environment. Little Red Riding Hood is just a little girl in the eyes of you and I, but in the eyes of the big bad wolf, she is dinner. Now, if the big bad wolf grew up in Little Red Riding Hood's family and viewed her as a sister rather than a food source, his reaction would probably differ when he saw her. We have these three researchers to thank for the constructivist theory. Published in 1982 as a compilation of over a decade of research, the constructivist approach to communication outlines this theory in its entirety. This article highlights many aspects of theory, including their philosophical foundations behind it and how to methodically implement this theory into future works. Some interesting points that they made in their work were the fact that they kind of had an issue with how traditional methodologies don't necessarily work for every situation. Now, they never once said it's my way or the highway and that you should only use this new constructivist approach, but quite often they encourage researchers to think out of the box in their methodologies. And they suggest that one should utilize methods for the problem or question at hand rather than prosing a question to fit a certain method. To argue these points, they often reference some of their past collaborations and results from those studies to help support themselves. One example of this is that they kind of would highlight the methods that they use for different questions and where they found issues in the analysis based on those methods that they used. They also argue for free response data collection as a standard prior to implementation of any method of research. They argue that this should be standard because each person is different and care should be taken to address as many differences as possible so that evaluations are as thorough as possible. Once this data is collected, the method should be refined appropriately in order to be structurally analyzed. So what exactly is constructivism? Constructivism is a communication theory that seeks to explain individual differences and the ability to communicate skillfully. This is kind of based on three different aspects of skillful communication. Social perception, which is the process of how one uses observed information of the social world. Message production, which is verbal and nonverbal messages generated with a goal in mind, and then to what degree that this is accomplished. And lastly, message reception, which is the comprehension of messages received of others, both superficially and in depth. Research utilizing constructivism, primarily on a general standpoint, will address the two following questions. Why are there individual differences in skills? And what are the origins of these differences? That first question tends to kind of err on the side of caution with that they just focus on the characteristics and qualities of individuals required for skillful communication. For example, individuals or groups that are better communicators than others are said to utilize a respective construct better than another. The second question, what are the origins of the differentiation in constructs, aims to explain how reality perception or interpretive orientation molds the foundation of communication. So where can one see these constructs in action? The constructivist theory continues to evolve as it is applied to new settings. This theory helps improve the understanding of many communication behaviors. So as time goes on, it would be easy to assume that things will just continue to change and that the definition of constructs will continue to evolve and more constructs will be found as time goes on. As one can see, it can be argued that this theory is the foundation for analysis of many qualitative studies in the social sciences, including mass media and public relations. The principles of this theory are broad enough that it's not hard to find examples that would be appropriate for constructive analysis, even in our daily social interactions. I've listed a bullet points of some common places that you can see constructivist framework in action, but it is definitely not limited to just these. An example of how constructivism is utilized in research is this article by Catherine C. Powell. Her work, named Cognitive and Social Constructivism, Developing Tools for an Effective Classroom, focuses on using constructivism techniques in the classroom to teach students new material. The first issue she ran into, though, in her studies was that there was a varied interpretation of what constructivist teaching means to teachers, and this counts for all educators of any age. So, according to Powell, she defined constructivist teaching as a method of teaching in which educators explain new concepts through existing knowledge or past experiences of the student to provide more meaning and relevance based on individual and social cognitive constructivism. So she kind of went through, after this definition, to kind of set a foundation for what she defines constructivist teaching. She provided tools that helped accomplish this goal for teachers, kind of keeping in mind that educating their students by providing an interactive and welcoming environment will help this constructive approach. She also encouraged teachers to allow her students to revisit their personal past experiences to help correlate with new material, which is right in line with how cognitive and social constructivism is taught in the classroom. And she also acknowledged that while not every educator agrees on what this method for teaching means, it's common to find that learning with meaning through existing knowledge greatly heightens meaning of new concepts. And so I just kind of found this interesting, that she approached it initially assuming almost that everybody knew what constructivist teaching was, as this was a cornerstone of a lot of ways that teachers teach in their classroom. but that everybody interpreted that very, very different. While her tools are very, very useful, I think most of her research turned into explaining what this meant rather than just providing those tools to help teachers. This is another example of how a study applied the constructive approach to teaching, focusing on teaching new material like a foreign language and cross-cultural differences between two different countries. A style of teaching intercultural communication competence that's based on students learning their own terms due to the language barrier and the benefits and faults of what this can entail. They define the resulting competence of the student based on how effectively he or she perceives the concepts presented, based on how well the student can personally relate. So they're saying that basically they're learning new cultures with the language barrier in mind. And the only way that people can find a common ground is based on their past experiences and how well they can see both verbally or see non-verbally how to relate those new cultures to their own experiences. One point that one quote from this article that I really found to kind of hit home the whole point of this was my last bullet point that says, by involving students in autonomous learning, initiative, discover, or cultural differences and personal experience of intercultural circumstances, this model can effectively help students to form judgment and interpretation of target cultural phenomena and accomplish their construction of intercultural knowledge and competence. A big issue that arises in constructivism theory research and application is that there can be so many different interpretations of what constitutes a construct, or what falls under which category under constructivism. Technically, the theory can encompass every observed social and communicative behavior. While this can be beneficial, more times than not it seems that this theory is too broad for effective interpretation in its entirety. By definition, the theory is based on what is perceived as reality, which is different for every single person, which in turn also causes every perception of the theory to be different. Powell ran into this issue when assessing the teacher sample by which to offer her research to. She found that many teachers were conflicted on what constructivist teaching actually entails. Another issue is that humans will always be changing based on their reaction to their ever-changing environments. In any study, there will always be outliers within a sample. However, sampling with a staunch adherence to constructs could pose very difficult. Then again, depending on your definition of what a construct is, it could be relatively easy. So due to the ambiguity of the theory and the short shelf life of each formulated construct, it is difficult to exactly recreate any research conducted with this foundation. The broad spectrum of constructivism is both a benefit and a fault that will always be evolving by definition, depending on your perspective, of course. Constructivism in agriculture. So I typed in a couple of different databases, just constructivism in agriculture, and came up with over 2,000 or 3,000 examples, articles, just based on those two keywords. I highlighted these 5 that I found the most interesting, all of which were also towards the top of each database, which I had kind of in order of, on like 2014 and 2013, the first 2 I have listed there. Those were just in chronological order on my search results, whereas the last 3, whichever database I used for each respective article, those were the ones that were cited the most within that system. So I found those kind of interesting just because they were referenced so many times. The first one, the role of TAC knowledge in developing networks for sustainable agriculture, was a study that utilized TAC knowledge as a construct and how to better utilize that to develop producer and consumer-based networks of sustainable agriculturalists. The second one, re-engineering agricultural theory education based on constructivism, engineering design, and systems thinking in farming systems of the province in Iran. They use their interpretation of constructivism as the foundation for teaching new agricultural technologies in an underdeveloped province in Iran. The third, the recombinant BGH controversy in the United States towards a new consumption of politics of food. This study was a political study of the controversy surrounding RBGH and the new class of consumers who care about their food based on an evaluation of various social theories, including social constructivism. The fourth, social theory and dereconstruction of agricultural science, local knowledge for an alternative agriculture. This study evaluated how sociological constructivism can provide tools for reconstructing how new technologies and production practices are taught and learned, primarily in rural areas. Lastly, an international relations perspective on the global politics of carbon dioxide capture and storage. This was a study that was released a little bit after the report of an increased level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And they evaluated how the results of this study were interpreted and what it meant for the attitudes towards climate change. As you can see, there are endless ways to utilize constructivism theory in both general social sciences as well as all topics of agricultural communication research. Depending on how you define constructivism and the constructs that is a foundation of analysis, the possibilities are quite literally endless.